It was an ordinary autumn day in 1984, when the small village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Loire in Western Europe was about to be thrust into a nightmare that would haunt its residents for decades. A 4-year-old boy, Luca Martin, vanished without a trace. His parents, like any loving parents would, searched desperately for him, calling out his name, running door to door through the village's narrow streets, hoping for a sign of their son. At first there was hope. People assumed that Luca had simply wandered off or that he had gotten lost in the thick woods surrounding the town. But as hours turned into days, that hope began to fade. The authorities were called in, the search efforts became more organized, and the small village began to fear the worst. Then days later, something was found. A small, innocent child's body discovered in a nearby river. But what followed was not just shock. It was confusion, frustration, and disbelief. Luca's body showed signs of being strangled. There were signs of torture, of manipulation, and cruelty that no one could have ever imagined coming from within this quiet town. The police and investigators had no leads, no clear suspects, just a broken family, a devastated village, and one haunting question. Who could commit such a heinous act against a child, and why? As the investigation deepened, secrets began to surface. The family dynamics were scrutinized. Whispers about hidden tensions started to fill the town, but still, no one could fathom who could be behind such brutality. Could Luca's murder have been a personal vendetta? Was it the work of a stranger with no connection to the family? Or did someone close to him have something to gain from ending his short life? The questions grew more complex, and as months passed, the mystery only deepened. The investigation led to dead ends, false confessions, and plenty of theories, but the case remained unsolved. To this day, the question of who killed Luca Martin still lingers, unanswered, unresolved. But what if the answers were always there, hidden in plain sight? What if Luca's death was not just the result of a random act of violence, but a calculated act by someone who had been watching, waiting, and planning all along? Was it a family secret that no one dared speak of? Or was it something darker, a deeper conspiracy no one had ever imagined? This is the story of Luca Martin, the French mystery that remains unsolved after decades. It's the story of a young child who was taken far too soon and a family in a village left with the haunting question: who killed little Luca? In the fall of 1984, a small, peaceful village in Western Europe was shaken by a crime that no one could have anticipated. Luca Martin, a 4-year-old boy with a bright future, had been playing outside as usual, full of life and energy. But on the evening of October 16th, something went terribly wrong. Luca vanished without a trace. What began as a typical day for the Martin family would soon spiral into an unspeakable tragedy. Luca's disappearance was sudden and alarming, and the panic began almost immediately. His mother, Isabel, noticed his absence as dusk settled over their quaint village. She called for him, expecting him to return, as he always did after a few hours of playing. But Luca didn't come back. Her search around the house and yard yielded no sign of him. The neighbors were quickly alerted, and soon the whole village was involved in a desperate search. At first, the community held out hope. They believed that Luca might have wandered off, as children often do, especially in such a quiet town. The streets were calm, the people were familiar, and the idea of something terrible happening in their peaceful village seemed almost impossible. But as the hours passed, that hope began to wane, and the reality set in. Luca was missing, and no one could find him. The next morning, the authorities were called in, and a formal search effort began. Local law enforcement, aided by volunteers from the town, scoured the surrounding woods, fields, and paths, hoping to find the little boy who had simply wandered too far. Still, there was no sign of Luca. No trace, no clue, no direction. Panic set in. A missing persons investigation was underway, but no one could imagine the horrors that were soon to unfold. Days turned into weeks, and the search continued, but the town's atmosphere shifted from hope to fear. Then in early November, the worst fears of the Martin family were realized. Luca's body was discovered in a river, not far from his home, abandoned, lifeless, and cold. The shock was immeasurable, and the grief was overpowering. The peaceful town, once filled with the laughter of children and the comfort of familiarity, now felt empty. A chilling silence hung over the village as the full scope of the tragedy began to unfold. Luca's death was ruled as a homicide, and authorities were left with one crushing question. Who could have done this? The brutality of the crime was unlike anything the town had ever experienced. Luca had been strangled, and the signs of abuse suggested that his death wasn't a random act. It was clear this was something far darker, far more personal than anyone had imagined. Luca Martin was a 4-year-old boy, the youngest in the Martin family, and known for his joyful spirit and his love of adventure. He lived in a quiet, picturesque village in Western Europe, where life moved at a slow pace and everyone knew everyone. Luca's family was close-knit, and to outsiders they seemed like any other ordinary family. But beneath the surface, there were complexities in their personal lives that would later come to light during the investigation. Luca's mother, Isabel, was a loving parent who was known for her devotion to her children. She was a quiet, reserved woman who worked hard to maintain the household and care for her family. However, her relationship with her husband, Julian, was known to be rocky. While not outwardly abusive, their marriage had its share of tensions. Julian, a man who worked long hours in a nearby factory, was described by some as having a quick temper and a lack of patience. It wasn't uncommon for him to take out his frustrations on the smallest of things, and many of their neighbors were aware of the underlying strain in the marriage. Though they kept much of their personal issues private, there were whispers about their relationship. Some residents in the village believed that Isabel's role as a mother had been the emotional anchor for the family, while Julian's temper and unpredictable nature kept the family dynamics fragile. Their marriage was by no means perfect, but it was never considered violent until Luca's tragic death. Luca's older siblings were very protective of him, and his family, though flawed, was close-knit. Isabel was extremely attentive to Luca's needs, often going out of her way to make him feel loved and safe. Despite the difficulties she faced with Julian, she worked hard to create a stable and nurturing environment for her children. But her maternal instincts and those of Luca's siblings were not enough to protect him from what would ultimately unfold. Within the village, life was simple. There were a few local shops, a church, and a town square that saw little traffic. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where everyone kept an eye out for one another. But in this seemingly perfect community, there was a hidden undercurrent of tension, and not just within the Martin household. Luca's disappearance shocked everyone, but as the investigation began, strange and unsettling details about the family, as well as the village, began to surface. Could Luca's death have been the result of a personal vendetta against his family? Was it possible that someone within the village had a darker side, one that no one had noticed before? Or was it someone closer to Luca's own family who had a deeper, more intimate reason for wanting to harm him? The investigation, which initially seemed focused on finding Luca's body, soon turned to the questioning of those closest to him. Could Luca's parents have been involved? Or was there something far more chilling happening in the background? On October 16, 1984, Luca Martin's disappearance was as sudden as it was alarming. He had been playing outside near his family's home in the small village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Loire, a village that, up until that point, had been the picture of peace and simplicity. Luca's mother, Isabel, had been busy with household chores that afternoon, and when she noticed that Luca hadn't returned from playing, she wasn't immediately concerned. It wasn't unusual for children to get caught up in play and lose track of time. However, as evening began to fall and Luca still didn't appear, Isabel grew anxious. She began calling for him, walking the grounds near their home, calling out his name, and asking neighbors if they had seen him. The atmosphere around the village shifted from mild concern to palpable panic. Isabel immediately alerted Julian, who returned home from work, and the two began a frantic search through the village. But as the hours passed, there was still no sign of Luca. By nightfall, the whole village was swept up in the search. People gathered, walking the paths, knocking on doors, and checking familiar spots where children would typically wander off. No one had seen Luca. His absence felt even more haunting because no one had heard or seen anything unusual. As the night wore on, and with no sign of Luca or any explanation for his disappearance, Isabel called the authorities. The local police arrived, and within hours they began organizing a formal search, aided by the village's residents. The police initially theorized that Luca might have gotten lost in the surrounding woods, or perhaps wandered down to the nearby river, as he had often shown curiosity about the water. However, as the hours stretched into the early morning, the hope of finding Luca alive began to fade. The search was exhaustive, but as days passed without finding Luca, the anxiety in the town grew more intense. News outlets began to pick up the story, and the case quickly gained national attention. Still, no sign of Luca was found. The community remained on edge, its sense of security shattered. After a week of searching, a breakthrough came when a local fisherman discovered a body floating in the river near the same spot where Luca had often played. The police quickly responded, and it was confirmed. The body was indeed that of Luca Martin. The sight of his small, lifeless body was a devastating blow to the village. However, as forensic teams examined Luca's body, they found evidence that shocked everyone. Luca had been strangled. The nature of his death was chilling. It was clear that his murder had been deliberate, not an accident. The investigation immediately turned from a search for a missing child to a homicide investigation, and all eyes were now on the people closest to Luca. The police began to ask the inevitable questions. Who could have done this to such an innocent child? The discovery of Luca's body in the river raised even more disturbing questions. Why was his body disposed of in such a public place, so close to the village? The location seemed to suggest a message, perhaps one that the killer wanted to leave behind. But who was the intended recipient of this message, and why did they choose Luca? At this point, the investigation took on a new, more urgent direction. Who had Luca encountered in the days leading up to his death? Was there anyone who might have had a reason to harm him? Or was Luca simply the victim of a random act of violence? With Luca's body discovered and the cause of death confirmed as strangulation, the case immediately took a darker turn. The peaceful village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Loire was thrown into shock, and the police knew that this was not a simple case of a missing child, but rather a deliberate murder. The entire town became a focal point of suspicion, and the investigation quickly expanded from a search for a lost child to a quest for answers as to who would commit such a horrifying crime. The police immediately began by questioning Luca's family, his parents, Isabel and Julian, who were the first ones to notice his disappearance. Naturally, the authorities started with the family because of the close proximity of the crime, but no one had expected what would unfold next. Both Isabel and Julian were interviewed multiple times, and their behavior during questioning raised eyebrows. Isabel was visibly distressed, while Julian was more stoic and guarded. Some local residents noted that Julian's temper had been a point of concern in the past, but no one had anticipated that this would lead to an investigation into his potential involvement in his own son's murder. The family, though, remained insistent that they were innocent, and there was no concrete evidence to suggest otherwise. They claimed that Luca's death was a random act, that someone must have snatched him from the yard while they were distracted. However, their alibis were shaky, and the police found inconsistencies in their stories. With the family under scrutiny, the investigation expanded beyond just them. The police turned their attention to the people of the village, a community where everyone knew everyone else, and yet no one had seen anything unusual the day Luca went missing. Some villagers recalled having seen Luca talking to a strange man on the afternoon of his disappearance, but no one could provide a clear description of the man or any other identifying details. A vague memory, nothing concrete. Suspicion began to fall on the residents who lived near the river where Luca's body was discovered. Could the killer have been someone familiar with the area, someone who knew the best place to dispose of the body without raising immediate suspicion? The police began to look into the backgrounds of the town's residents, hoping to uncover any motives or histories that might explain such an act of violence. One theory that emerged early on was that Luca had been targeted by a local predator, someone who had been watching him and his family for some time. The idea that the killer had been someone from the village, a resident with intimate knowledge of the Martin family and their routine, seemed plausible. The small, tight-knit nature of the community meant that everyone had the opportunity to observe the Martins, their habits, and their vulnerabilities. Could it have been someone Luca knew, someone who had gained his trust before striking? Another theory involved the personal life of Luca's father, Julian. While his interactions with the police were under scrutiny, there were whispers in the community about Julian's relationship with his wife, Isabel. Some residents mentioned that their marriage had been fraught with tension, with occasional arguments overheard by neighbors. Julian's temper had reportedly flared in the past, though no one had expected such violence to manifest in such a horrific way. Could Luca's death have been a result of an argument between his parents, with someone taking their frustrations out on the child? Investigators also began to consider whether Luca's murder could have been part of a larger, more disturbing pattern of crimes. Could he have been just one of several victims of an ongoing crime spree? Or was his death an isolated act of violence? Authorities had no evidence to suggest a pattern, but the brutality of the crime suggested that whoever was responsible might have committed similar acts before and could very well do so again. Despite the mounting theories, no clear suspects emerged. The investigation remained stalled, with no new evidence pointing directly to a perpetrator. Every theory had its flaws, and every lead seemed to go cold. The pressure on the police continued to mount, but as time passed, the community's sense of security slowly eroded. No one knew who to trust anymore, and suspicion lingered in every corner of the village. As the months went by, the investigation into Luca Martin's death became increasingly tangled and frustrating. The authorities had been unable to find a breakthrough, and the case remained shrouded in mystery. The townspeople, once hopeful that the killer would soon be found, began to lose faith in the police's ability to uncover the truth. Despite dozens of leads and several potential suspects, the investigation had stalled. Theories about Luca's murder ranged from it being the work of a local predator to a family dispute gone horribly wrong, but there were no hard facts to corroborate any of these ideas. Forensic evidence was scarce, and the police found themselves circling the same questions without any new answers. The case grew colder by the day. In 1992, 8 years after Luca's murder, the investigation received a shocking lead that would reignite public interest in the case. A new witness came forward. A local woman who had been quiet for years but now claimed to have seen something strange on the day of Luca's disappearance. The witness said she had seen a man with a distinctive tattoo walking near the riverbank around the time Luca had vanished. This description was vague at best, but it was enough to suggest that someone in the village might know more than they had previously shared. The police immediately pursued this lead, re-interviewing old suspects, including people who had been cleared early in the investigation. One name kept resurfacing: Damien Dufresne, a man who had been questioned years earlier but had not been considered a serious suspect. Dufresne was known to have a criminal record, and he had spent time in jail for a previous crime. He had been one of the last people seen in the area around the time Luca had gone missing, and while his initial interviews had not yielded anything conclusive, there were rumors circulating that he might have been involved in more than just petty theft. Despite the resurfacing theories and increased attention, there was still no hard evidence linking Damien Dufresne to the murder. Investigators dug deeper into his background and personal life, but each new detail only seemed to deepen the mystery. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence to connect him to the crime. Dufresne denied any involvement, and without concrete proof, the police could not make an arrest. His involvement remained a dark shadow over the case, but nothing could definitely tie him to Luca's death. As years turned into decades, the case remained unsolved, and the public's fascination with Luca's murder grew. The investigation turned into a national obsession. The mystery behind the young boy's death began to take on a legendary quality, but the question of who was truly responsible remained unanswered. In 2016, a new theory emerged from an independent investigator, a journalist who had spent years researching the case. This theory proposed that Luca's death had been part of a larger criminal network operating in the region, one that involved people from outside the village and perhaps even beyond the borders of the country. This was a shocking and unsettling twist, suggesting that Luca had been targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with his family or the village at all. But again, this theory had no concrete proof to back it up, and the police were unable to substantiate the claim. The investigation into Luca's murder has now spanned more than 3 decades, and it remains one of the most haunting and unresolved cases in Western Europe. Despite renewed efforts and theories, the truth remains elusive, and the question that continues to linger is the same as it was in 1984. Who killed little Luca Martin and why? The case is far from closed. New evidence still surfaces from time to time, but with every new lead, the mystery grows even more complicated. Could Luca's murder have been the work of someone close to him, someone in the village? Or was it a crime of opportunity committed by someone with no connection to Luca's family or the town? Could the killer still be out there, hiding in plain sight? The shocking twist is that, after all these years, the truth is still buried beneath layers of doubt and speculation. Whether the case will ever be solved is a mystery in itself, one that continues to haunt the community and Luca's family. But the question remains, what happened to little Luca Martin and who will ever pay for his death? As we come to the end of Luca Martin's tragic case, the haunting question still lingers. Who killed little Luca? Decades have passed since that fateful day in 1984, and the case remains one of the most perplexing and heart-wrenching mysteries in Western Europe. Despite years of investigation, false leads, and shifting theories, the true identity of Luca's killer remains elusive. Was it someone close to him, a family member or a neighbor? Or was it a stranger whose connection to the crime has yet to be uncovered? Is the killer still living among us, hiding in plain sight? Or is the case simply one that we will never fully understand? I want to know what you think. After hearing the details of the case, do you believe Luca's death was the result of a personal vendetta? Or do you think it was a more random act of violence? Was there a failure in the investigation? Or were the authorities on the right track all along? Do you believe that Damien Dufresne was involved? Or do you think there's a completely different explanation for Luca's death? Could there have been a larger conspiracy at play, as some have suggested? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The case of little Luca has baffled investigators for decades, and your perspective could shed new light on the mystery. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on this ongoing investigation. Until then, remember, some mysteries are never fully solved and the answers may remain hidden forever. But as long as we keep asking the hard questions, we keep hope alive for the truth.